You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast featuring some of Indiana's most fascinating men and women whose impact has shaped our state, our communities, and us. Join us as we discuss their imprint on our history. Leaders and Legends is brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated, your local veteran business enterprise specializing in public relations, media relations, public outreach, crisis communications, and digital photography. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, former Deputy Chief of Staff to Mayor Greg Ballard, and Communications Director for the Indiana Republican Party. I'm honored to be your host for our discussion. Thank you for joining us today on Leaders and Legends. We're here with Nate Feltman, businessman extraordinaire, one of the most well-liked people you'll ever meet. Has an incredible business career, an incredible personal history, which we're going to get into. He's done some absolutely amazing things, and quite frankly, he's done them all around the world. And we're very grateful to have you today, Nate. Thank you.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me, Robert.
Nate, tell the Leaders and Legends podcast audience a little bit about where you're from, where you were educated, and how you got where you are today.
Sure. Mostly from Indiana, but I was born in Virginia, Newport News, Virginia. My dad was in the Army, and so I was born on an Army base in Newport News. And then he moved and started his dental practice in South Bend, Indiana, which is where I spent most of my growing up years, Mishawaka, South Bend. A little bit of time in upstate New York during my middle school years, and then back to northern Indiana, and then college down in Bloomington, a good old IU, and law school here in Indianapolis. And then, which is a little unusual for an Indiana guy, I spent a year studying Russian law at a Russian law school to do what's called an LLM, a master's degree in Russian law. So I had a phenomenal experience then and thereafter in the former Soviet Union.
Was your father career military?
No, he just went in after dental school. He was trying to decide whether he was going to specialize and decided to become an endodontist after being in the Army for a couple of years and specialized in endodontics. And he just served for a few years in the Army.
Endodontist, that's the person who gives me my root canal.
The root canals. Everybody's favorite, the root canal.
So when your dad says, Nate, it's not a root canal, he knew what he was talking about.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Were you in South Bend for some good Notre Dame football years? Did you go to many games?
Absolutely. As a kid, I ended up going to quite a few games. I went to the first night game. I remember being there for the first night game. I can't tell you exactly what year it was, but
is that where they beat Michigan?
It might have been. It was the first night game. I remember the 1988 was my senior year in high school. It was the year they won the national championship. I think it was the last year they won the national championship. It was 1988. So I got to see a national championship. So I always say I am a Notre Dame fan until they play IU, at which point I become an Indiana fan. But rarely have they played. But I was at the only, or at least the most recent game where Notre Dame played IU in football, and that was, again, some years ago. It was probably 15, 20 years ago. But that was another good one to be at.
Because Mallory was the coach.
Right. And, of course, Notre Dame beat them, but it was a good game. Like all IU games, it was a good game until the end.
The Purdue fans have a name for people like you and me who root for Notre Dame football and root for IU basketball. Do you know what that name is?
What is it?
They call us reversible jackets, which I can get from their perspective.
Well, when you grow up in South Bend, it's hard not to root for the hometown team.
All right. When you're Catholic and have IU degrees, it's hard not to root for both teams. I think that first night game was the Notre Dame-Michigan game where Reggie Ho kicked all the field goals.
That sounds familiar.
And that was the game they won on the way to a national championship.
Yeah, that sounds very familiar.
Did you ever entertain? Did you want to go to Notre Dame?
So it's funny. I applied to one school and one school only, and that was IU Bloomington. Both my parents went to IU, and I was brainwashed at a very, very young age watching IU basketball, watching Bobby Knight, which we're sitting in my office. You can see I have a little statue of Bobby Knight up there that was given to me some years ago. And there was never a decision to be made. I applied to one school only. I knew I was going to IU.
And what if you hadn't gotten in?
Well, then we would have a problem.
We'd be doing a podcast with someone else.
That's right.
What was your undergraduate major at IU?
So I did 2 degrees. I was really fascinated with business. So I did a business degree through the Kelley School, but then I doubled up and I did a degree through the School of Arts and Sciences, a political science degree. And that was when I had to make a choice about a language. In order to get that degree, I had to have a language. I studied French, but I was not very interested at the time in France, and therefore I didn't study it that seriously. But at that time in the world, this was 1988 when I enrolled down at IU. This was a time of great change and great possibilities in the world, with Reagan and Gorbachev getting together and talking about ending the Cold War. And when I enrolled as a freshman down at IU, I took an arms control class, which really piqued my interest and interest in Russia. I was studying things like mutual assured destruction and all these other acronyms that we can remember, and became fascinated about the geopolitics of the time, and decided to take Russian language as part of my political science degree, and then went on to continue to study in the Soviet Union and then Russia. But I did two separate degrees, a business school degree and a School of Arts and Sciences political science degree.
And as we get deeper and deeper into this podcast, you'll understand why Nate is so well thought of and so successful. You seem to relish learning.
That's a good point, and that's nice of you to say. But for me, that is what I feel like life is a lot about. And one of the things I think life about is continuous learning. And I have always said that when I start to get a little bit bored, I'm ready for a change. And a lot of times in my life, they've been big changes, big career changes, because I do relish learning. I feel like that is what propels me, keeps me interested, keeps me learning, keeps me meeting new people, doing new things. I love to always be learning, and if I get to any one point in life where I'm not, usually I look for an opportunity for some significant change.
What about the experience in Bloomington has stuck with you? We've had several people on the podcast who've graduated from IU. The reviews are universally favorable. Everybody said it was a blast. They'd go back there tomorrow.
Yeah.
You went there right after they won the national championship in '87, but they had some good basketball teams.
They went to the Final Four my senior year in '92.
You got into the Cheney years.
Yeah.
And so just talk a little bit about why IU, why has it stuck with you so much? And basically, why does it just seem to be so fun?
Well, to me, it was more than fun. It was certainly fun. I had a great time. I was in a fraternity and enjoyed all parts of college life. But for me, the thing when I think about IU, and it's what I tell kids that I talk to who are considering IU among their college choices, it offered any and all opportunities to pursue your interest. And I was fortunate enough, I kind of created my own degree tracks, but I could explore anything and everything from any language on the planet, and IU is known for its languages. Russian language, it happened to be, and it still is, one of the top 4 or 5 schools in the country that teaches Russian. But it's like that in almost every language. So if you want any type of liberal arts education, IU is phenomenal. And of course, their business school has been known for decades to be a top-notch business school. It fulfilled all of my interests. I studied abroad when I was at IU. I worked in D.C. through an internship with then Senator Coates, and he was just became senator for the first time in 1990. I did a semester there. I could do anything and everything that I wanted to do, and having that almost like a buffet of different options in front of me, that's what, for me, was most awesome about IU. And I've always cherished it. I've stayed engaged as an alumnus. I'm on the now it's called the Hamilton Luger School of the Global School and International School of Studies, and it's phenomenal. It's only 6 years old, but it has all of the languages, the cultural studies, the history studies of the international and diplomacy all under one roof now. And I'm also engaged at the law school, the McKinney Law School, on the board of visitors. So the law school and the undergrad were just such great education that I feel that I want to give back where I can.
And that's been a common theme. We've had David Frick on the podcast who went to IU. Jim Morris on the podcast, obviously is a huge IU booster. Greg Ballard is another one, and others. And it just seems to be a singularly phenomenal institution. My degrees are IU degrees, but I went to IPY. When I would go down in graduate school to do research at IU on my thesis, just the difference down in Bloomington as opposed to an urban campus, and this is not a slam at all at IPY, which is leaps and bounds ahead of what it was just when I graduated 20 years ago. But you get down there and you feel like you're actually in a university, and you get in that library and you just get lost.
Yeah.
It's a lot more than sports. It's a lot more than basketball.
Absolutely. I mean, I spent a lot of time in that library. I was one of the kids that studied a lot. There were kids who didn't study a lot. I studied a lot. But, to your point about the regional campuses, though, I mean, I went to law school at IUPUI, and I had a great experience there. The professional schools are fantastic. And I also took a lot of summer school up at South Bend, IU South Bend, because I was doing 2 degrees. I had to take 9 to 12 hours every summer if I wanted to graduate in 4 years, because I graduated with like 162 credit hours to get there and to get 2 degrees. So I have a lot of respect for everything that IU has done around the state and their different campuses. But you're right, there's something special about Bloomington. That's where I spent most of my time. And for me, it's just the diversity of offerings is amazing.
One of the most unique things about you is your study in the former Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
You talked a little bit about choosing Russian as a language. The only Russian I know is from The Hunt for Red October.
Okay.
So you actually could watch the movie and didn't need the subtitles, right?
That's right.
What?
That's right.
Nuparuski? I think that's the only...
Govorite po-ruski?
That's all I remember.
Yeah, you got it.
And so what was it like being there as opposed to, I mean, the United States is either envied or reviled for its bounty.
Mm-hmm.
And if you read books about the end of the Cold War and that time period, especially a book I would recommend is by Ken Edelman, and it's called Reagan at Reykjavik.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all about the summit between Gorbachev and Reagan.
Right.
And he has a quote in there. It's a phenomenal book. If you love history, especially Cold War history, please pick it up. It's terrific. Where Gorbachev is trying to negotiate these missiles arms reduction, and he looks at Shevardnadze, who was his foreign minister, and kind of snaps at him and says, we can't provide our people with enough toothpaste. Right. How are we going to compete with SDI?
Right.
So that's a long way of me saying, what the hell was it like over there? And did you come back with an even greater appreciation of the United States?
So I did, to answer your last question, come back with a different kind of appreciation for the United States. But when I went over there in 1990, it was still the Soviet Union. And it literally looked like, and it really hadn't changed for 50 years, even in 90. I mean, that's a little too drastic to say, but not a lot drastic to say. You had no consumerism. There were, as Americans, we're used to a lot of consumerism. So you walk down the street at the Soviet Union in 1990. The stores don't say Nike and name your other store. They say shoes. They say food. And, it's not a branded restaurant. It says restaurant. So, and it was all black and white. That's how I felt. It was very gray and black and white. And there was lack of any consumer goods at that time. And, of course, Soviet citizens couldn't travel, and there was no freedom of speech, et cetera. But it was literally, I describe it often as like walking on another planet. You felt like you had gone to another planet. So it was incredibly different. But on the other side of it, you had these the citizens who were so yearning for information. So they would ask me, I had kids my age that I was interacting with. I was studying Russian language, so I had to get to meet some Russians. And they wanted to know what was going on in the world. And are the streets really paved with gold in the United States? Can you really buy dog food at a grocery store? I mean, they actually sell it that way. And there's more than one choice of dog food. I mean, these things were, this is very strange, right? And so...
and what was your reaction to that? I mean, did you just kind of look at him like,
what?
Course.
Or
did you start to feel sorry for
We
him?
talked about, things that were popular for kids back then. Who were the rock groups that were popular and different movies. And that's what, it was pop culture that they were really starving for and trying to get, and they did on the black market sometimes. But the piece I wanted to mention is that what I gained an appreciation for that, as an American, I really hadn't, was the Russians' appreciation for the arts and for the symphony, the ballet, and literature,
science,
and science,
chess.
and when you don't have consumerism, what can replace it? Well, not for all Soviet citizens, but for a lot of them. I mean, they were very literate, very well read, and they had interest in, Shostakovich, not necessarily all the things that we were interested in. So it gave me a great appreciation, again, kind of to your initial question of learning. I said, wow, I mean, these people are studying, they're learning, and again, they're not getting all the opportunities that we are, but it gave me appreciation that I don't have to have all the the newest this or the newest that to be happy. I can be happy by learning, and that was a big part of what stuck with me when I came back to the U.S. I mean, I like anybody else, I like nice things, but I started to really appreciate that life is a lot more than consumer products, and that was a big impact.
What was the process like to even be allowed to enter? Is it through the university? So
yeah,
it's a little easier.
So IU, again, talk about IU. IU has had a program going to the Soviet Union going back to the late 50s, like 58 or 1960. So that had a long-standing program where they take Indiana University and some other students from other universities would be allowed to participate. It'd be a group of 15, 20 students studying Russian language in the Soviet Union. So they had it all worked out. But it's still today. I'm going to Russia in October with another organization I'm involved in called the Liberty Fund. And today it's still very difficult the visa process. And the reason it's that way is because it's very difficult for Russians to come this way. It's tit for tat. You always remember the tit for tat in every sphere of economics and politics. Visa system, no different. It's tit for tat. They do what we do, and we do what they do. Makes it difficult.
Do you remember something that you had or something that you said that enthralled the Russians, the Soviets, the most? Whether it was a piece of electronics or
I'll give you an example. Not necessarily enthralled, but when I worked for a law firm over there. And this is always interesting, kind of a different perspective other than the Americans. So I'll move into politics for a second. So you recall the Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky scandal, right?
Yes, sir.
And that was a big deal in America, right? So my assistant, my legal secretary at Baker McKenzie came in one day and said, What are you guys doing with this scandal in America? I mean, why is this such a big deal? I said, well, it's really, it's a big deal in America for a lot of reasons, but one is, you got the President of the United States not telling the truth and this and that and the other. And she said, well, if that happened to Yeltsin, Yeltsin was president at the time, if that happened to Yeltsin and found out he had an affair, we'd be cheering. I mean, wow, he actually has that enough energy to be able to sustain something like that.
And that was kind of the general European reaction.
That was an interesting, kind of reaction to what was big news here was in Russia. They couldn't figure out, why is this such a huge deal?
Well, with the different control of the press, it may not have been such a big deal. Right. Did you get to meet any famous Soviets, famous Russians whose names perhaps we would know?
I've met some since, not when I was living there per se. I've met a number of people who've served in the administrations over time there. Somebody I've always wanted to meet and never had the chance. I thought I was close to meeting him once was Gorbachev, Mikhail Gorbachev. I would just, coming of age as a high school, college student when Reagan and Gorbachev were meeting. And so I had always thought, gosh, it would be awesome to talk to him because, the common thinking, or at least what's been written about over the years, is that Gorbachev never intended the Soviet Union to collapse. He wanted to make reforms. Glasnost, perestroika were his famous reforms, which means perestroika means restructuring, glasnost means openness. And he was trying to make changes, and things got away from him and ended up not going exactly the way he thought. And so, but to have a conversation with him, he's still alive today, and hearing about what it was like to be in that spot with Reagan, and now having myself been to Russia numerous times since the collapse of the Soviet Union, for to get his reaction, and he's been interviewed lots of times. But I would love to meet him. He's someone that I haven't had a chance to talk to. I'd love to.
Well, I think that's gonna. Yeah. You've already previewed your answer to one of our 5 questions as we end the podcast later. What would you ask him If you had a chance to sit down to him, you could speak to him in Russian, I'm assuming, and have a great conversation. And what would you want to know?
Я скажу. You want me to say it right? No, I'm teasing. I would just like to have a beer with him and talk to him about, what his intentions exactly were and what now, seeing society as it is today with a leader that they have in Putin. And I was there during a lot of the transition years. The 90s were a period of incredible transition.
Were you there during the actual takeover or the attempted coup against Gorbachev?
I was not there at that time. So I was there 90, 94, and 95 through 98. So I just missed it. I think 91 was really when it occurred. But to have his vision of he was in the seat making decisions and to see what's transformed since then, the 90s were a decade of great hope. There's a lot of euphoria about what could be in Russia, and a lot of it hasn't transpired. Some of it has. You can now, there's freedom of movement and some freedom of speech. You have to be careful if you're a journalist in Russia today. A lot of them have been killed for breaking stories that the authorities didn't want to have broken. And but a lot of things have changed for the positive. I mean, people can live a lot different and better lives in many ways, but it'd be a great conversation to have.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast, presented by Veteran Strategies and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, our friend Aaron Shaler with Grandview Lending, and MacAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. We're here with Nate Feltman, who, as you have heard already, has had a phenomenal career. We've only gotten to about 10% of it, so we're going to move ahead. But I do want to ask you one more question. In late 1989, or maybe it was early 1990, Time magazine named Mikhail Gorbachev as its Man of the Decade for the 1980s. Mm-hmm. As someone who's a fan of both the former General Secretary and President Ronald Reagan, do you agree with that choice?
Well, I'm a much bigger fan of the former President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. But I think Gorbachev had a huge role in peacefully ending the Cold War. It could have gone a lot of different ways, and there's a lot of material, books and hundreds of books, thousands of books written on, the end of the Cold War, what precipitated the end of the Cold War, and people can argue about that, and we don't have time to go into that in detail. But I think Gorbachev played a pivotal role, and he was the right guy at the right time. Reagan even said that, a negotiating partner that he could actually, communicate. He famously said that, I'd like to negotiate, but they keep on dying on me.
That's
right.
Which was only funny because Reagan was in his 70s.
Right. So he played a big role. I think he certainly, again, you can debate whether he meant to do what happened, because I don't think he did necessarily, but things got away when he started loosening the reins.
How much influence or power came out of President Reagan saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall"?
I think that was a huge moment in history. That speech they gave at the wall was heard. I mean, a lot of of course, Soviet Union tried to keep out a lot of media reports like that, but that one was heard, and there were lots of ways for Soviet citizens to get information, and that was a lot. And calling the Soviet Union the evil empire was also a big deal. I've heard people talk about it, and so making a stark comparison of what could be and what people were living in, those were very, very important moments in history.
Any good biography or chronicle of Ronald Reagan or the Reagan years?
Well, the most recent one
focuses on the internal argument over Reagan saying, right, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall."
Absolutely. There's a great book most recently that I really enjoyed reading. It's by Brett Baer on Reagan's trip to Moscow, when he speaks to students at Moscow State University. For those that like that history, it's a really unique one, and I think he talks about before that trip, or maybe right after that piece. You're right.
You mentioned pivotal moments and pivotal leaders. Let's fast forward several years. Mm-hmm. In 2000, 2004, this fella is cajoled, begged, coerced, convinced to run for governor. Mm-hmm. His name was Mitch Daniels. Did you have any sort of relationship with Mitch before he ran? Did you know him at all? Because you played a very, very big role in his subsequent administration.
No, I didn't. And but the guy who helped me be a part of that it certainly was Mitch, because I had volunteered when I was a lawyer at Ice Miller. I had volunteered on the campaign, and I heard a lot about Mitch and knew a lot of people who were very close to him, saying what a incredible leader he could be for our state. But Mickey Maurer, who I know you've had on this podcast, mm-hmm. He was the one who really reached out to me and got me directly involved in coming to work with him in the formation of the IEDC. But I couldn't have been more excited, in that time period in 2004 when Mitch was elected and what was in store for the state of Indiana.
You mentioned earlier about Turner being involved in Senator Coates's mm-hmm. office. Mm-hmm. Did you have a big political background or experiences before 2004?
So I had a little bit. So I when I was a kid, I volunteered for Congressman Hyler up in my neck of the woods, John Hyler. And so it ran in my family. My uncle was Secretary of State of Indiana from 1978 to 1986. His name's Ed Simcox. He's my uncle. And my grandfather, his father, was LaPorte County chairman for years and involved in Republican politics. So every Thanksgiving, Christmas time, around the table, we were talking politics and what was going on in the world. So I was exposed at a young age to certainly to politics and the importance of government and what could be done and what should be done. So it was around the family. And then when I was in law school, I worked for the Secretary of State's office. Sue Ann Gilroy was Secretary of State, and I did a short stint in the corporations division while I was finishing up law school. So I had some exposure there.
We asked quite a few questions of Mr. Maurer when it came to the IEDC, and mm-hmm. we pigeonholed him a little bit as maybe a Democrat, and he kind of corrected us, rightfully right. so, and said he's more of a moderate liberal Republican, and that's where he looks to put his votes and his time. But it was certainly portrayed by the news media as another example of Mitch Daniels being able to bring people together, much like the Kernan-Shepard Commission. The IEDC was not in existence until Mitch Daniels created it as governor. Why do you think the IEDC was necessary, and what do you think about the work it's done in the last 5 to 10 years?
Sure. Well, we had been running economic development in the state in a pretty bureaucratic way. And the idea of the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, which was actually started germinating before Mitch was governor, but Mitch is the one that put it into action. And it was to allow the enterprise, this quasi-governmental agency, private-public agency, to operate more like a private company and not be bound by all the rules of government all the time. And so the idea was a very good one, and it's been a huge success. And it was like a lot of things Governor Daniels did. He looked around the country, sometimes looked around the world to see what was working and what wasn't working. And you looked at some states that had a similar setup. I think Florida was one, where Jeb Bush was governor and had set up an economic development corporation, and it was working. And so you brought in business people that knew how to negotiate deals and knew how to have some judgment, and not everything is objective. It shouldn't be. It's some subjectivity to getting, the best deal for the state of Indiana in certain situations. And we went out with like salesmen and deal makers and went out into the world, and Mitch armed us to do that, and we were successful right away. We landed big opportunities with Honda and some of the other Japanese auto manufacturers, and started going to places we hadn't been in years, like Japan, where Democrat governors had decided to not spend time, and it was the right time in our state's history to reengage.
Do you get the sense that these companies and these organizations, as much as they may have found Indiana or Hoosiers or both enticing, that it really was, they were kind of buying into Mitch Daniels?
There's no doubt. So I would say, when a company is looking, it doesn't matter if they're an international company or a domestic company, when they're looking for places to make investments, they're looking for predictability. They're looking for, an environment that's going to allow them to succeed. And they knew from Governor Daniels' agenda and what he was doing from the very day he took office that he was trying to make Indiana a better place to live, to grow jobs, to bring investment. And everything he did, it was about making Indiana a better place so that there were more opportunities for every person, every Hoosier. And that's what they witnessed, and that's what they saw. And there was predictability about that. So low taxes are important, but so are a lot of other things. And Mitch was working on all of them, as soon as he possibly could.
Recently, a really good friend of yours, who just happens to be the governor of the state of Indiana, announced his intention to seek re-election. Mm-hmm. Talk to us a little bit about your views on Eric Holcomb, both as governor and as a person.
Yeah, so I was lucky. I got to know our governor way back when I was volunteering for Mitch's campaign. Eric was a political hire for the campaign and was doing great work in different constituencies. He was organizing the hunters and the veterans and every constituent group you could imagine. He was working on it and doing a great job. So I got to know him back then. And then, of course, after Mitch Daniels won, I got to work with him, and he was in the governor's office working with Mitch, and I was working with Mickey and Pat Miller at the Indiana Economic Development Corporation. Got to know him as just a great human being. I mean, just phenomenal, trustworthy, high integrity, great individual, and always a great teammate. And that was my view of Eric, and I think everybody that worked with Eric knew him as such. Since he's become governor, I think he's been just what our state needed. We had some controversy, as you well know, certainly in central Indiana with RFRA. Eric had worked for lots of different people in his history, starting with Hostetler, and then, of course, with Mitch, and then with Pence as chairman, and lots of different folks. So the question was, what kind of governor is Eric going to be? Is he going to be real inclusive of everybody, and a governor for all Hoosiers, or is he going to cause controversy? And nobody knew for sure. But I've been very pleased with how effective he has been, and being able to bring people together. And I hear all the time, I have Democratic friends who say he's done a good job, and that when you hear that, that means things are going pretty darn well.
I've said this on Indiana Week in Review and in other places. I guess I should say that Governor Holcomb has agreed to come on the Leaders and Legends podcast, so we're incredibly excited about that. I was in the Army, he was in the Navy, so I hope there's no real fight. Mm-hmm. It's just a play fight. But his travels, he has to be the most traveled governor, and by my traveled, I mean in the state of Indiana.
Oh, yeah.
All that he's done politically, he was with Daniels in 2004.
Right.
He ran Daniels' campaign in 2008. Then he's state party chairman. Mm-hmm. Then he's Senator Dan Coates' state director.
Right.
Then he's running for the Senate. Then he becomes LG. To me, Holcomb is the first MTV governor. And when I say that, I mean that he has a naturally disarming, deflecting way about him.
Yeah.
Where he's kind of like Greg Ballard. You wouldn't know what they were doing for a living unless they told you.
Right.
Because they act so self-effacing and down to earth.
Absolutely.
Talk a little bit about why you think Eric specifically is headed for even more success in the governor's office from a personality standpoint.
Yeah. Well, I think you hit it on the head already, Robert. I mean, he is just a guy's guy, somebody that you want to hang out with, but just incredibly inclusive. And I think it's important. We have 6.5 million approximately Hoosiers, and when you're in a political role in the government, you're the governor for all 6.5 million Hoosiers, and I think he takes that really seriously. And when I see him reaching out to the mayor of Gary to go on a trip, I think he was in Canada doing some job searching, and I mean stuff matters, and he's that guy. So I think he has a lot more opportunity to be more successful. Our state has made a lot of progress over the years, but you can't rest, and there's a lot more that we need to do. Workforce is one. Public health, I think, is another, where we are suffering as a state, and it costs billions and billions a year in lost healthcare costs because of being high on the smoking and obesity charts. And talent is another one where we just need to do more to recruit people back to the state and keep people in the state. And I know these are things that he's really focused on. And I think there's some not to pun, but there are some major moves going back to the Mitch Daniels days. There's some major moves that if he's given a second chance, I think to be governor another term, I think he'll make some major moves. And he calls it next level, but I'm used to the major moves still.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast, presented by Veteran Strategies Incorporated and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, our friend Aaron Shaler from Grandview Lending, and MacAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. We're here with Nate Feltman, entrepreneur, Russophile, and defender. Russophile. Thank you very much, Russophile. Is it fair to say, before we move on, that the history of Indiana in the modern sense will be pre-Mitch Daniels and post-Mitch Daniels? That he represents a true watershed in the history of modern Indiana?
I would make that argument. I would say that he showed Hoosiers the art of the possible, that we shouldn't just to think we're just okay and the status quo is okay, that we can reach for the stars, and that it's okay to take a risk, because, a lot of times Hoosiers are known as not being great risk takers. Well, there are a lot of great Hoosier risk takers. Mickey's written about a lot of them in his book. But there are many, and Mitch is one of them. And he went out on a limb on a number of different issues, and he sometimes got the feedback, not in a positive way sometimes, but he was willing to go out there, and it's because he cared. I believe deeply that he cares truly, still to this day. He's doing it in the role as president of Purdue University, about making Indiana a better place from his very core. And he happens to have the smarts and the business experience and the political experience to make it happen. That combination of caring and doing it for the right reasons, not looking for the next job, and also having all the experiences and the IQ does not come along very often. So I'd say, to your point, we had a rare opportunity, and I'm on the board of an organization called the Mitch Daniels Leadership Foundation, where we have a fellows class. We just initiated 20 new fellows, and one of the main points there is to try to identify the next Mitch Daniels and give them the resources and the network to be able to do that. But those are a dime a dozen, so it's not going to be easy. But I think you're right. I think it was a watershed event, but I think it gives us the art of the possible.
And so when you are in the administration, or at least tangentially connected to the administration through the IEDC, and you have a front seat for all these amazing things that he's trying to accomplish, that the administration's trying to accomplish. I was
in the administration because I was in the cabinet, and so Mitch always put business and economic development as number one. So I always got to sit to the right directly to the right. So I got to see it all in action. Fantastic.
And when you're working your tail off, right?
Yeah.
15 hours, 16 hours a day, weekends, trips.
Correct.
And you hear, we won't necessarily name, but you hear an antagonistic opposition leader say, well, we've never done it that way before, which was said. Did that just want to make you pull your hair out and say, yeah, I know, and that's why we're doing it this way now, because we've never done it this way before, and it shows?
It didn't really, for me. It didn't make me want to do that, and I think a lot of people felt that way because, there was something, Mitch could connect with anybody. I mean, he connected with, he go into every county of the state and connect everybody. And so there started to be a groundswell of support for change. I mean, there were the difficult, first couple of years.
I was at state party for those years.
Going to a new, daylight saving time. It was one that seemed like outsized, reaction. Farmers were concerned about, all sorts of things and just crazy, but, these are things that I guess impact people's lives, right? And so, but once Hoosiers got used to the idea, we're going to try some things. They're not all going to work probably, but you won't know until you try. And a lot of them actually worked. And that, going back to, Mitch had spent so much time and his team researching things that worked and doing things that we believed and they believed would lead to positive outcomes for all Hoosiers. And so I guess you can't let the naysayers somehow limit your aggressiveness and limit your opportunities. And I don't think Mitch ever let that happen, and the team around him didn't. Here's the thing. Mitch had a lot of business people, and business people are used to naysayers. They're used to being poo-pooed, and they're used to recovering when things go wrong. So when you bring in a lot of risk takers who've done that in business to government, good things can happen.
I knew you when I was comms director at the Indiana Republican Party, and you were at IEDC. Uh-huh. We'd met a few times. But where I really got to know you, and quite frankly, would walk out of meetings going, damn, I wouldn't mind being that guy, Nate Feltman, was when I was Deputy Chief of Staff and Communications Director for Mayor Greg Ballard and was doing the messaging for the utility deal between the city and Citizens Energy. You were helping us as a consultant on the outside.
I was the lawyer for the city.
I was trying not to use the word lawyer.
Oh, well, I
you embrace
unlike
it?
Some people, I won't name names, Mitch Daniels, but unlike some people, I admit that I did practice law for quite some time.
And our podcast with him, which has not yet been aired, I think he said he malpracticed law. That's a direct quote.
No, I'm sure he did a lot better than that.
You got to work with another leader. And this leader was a little bit of more of a surprise, to say the least, and that was Greg Ballard.
Right.
Talk a little bit to the Leaders and Legends podcast audience about your impressions of Greg Ballard, the person, and how he performed as mayor.
Yeah. Well, I say this often, that I believe Mayor Ballard and Governor Mitch Daniels had a lot in common. And it's one really, really important thing that they had in common that I think is a really important sign of a good leader, which is choosing great people to work for you and then going to let them do their job. Just let them do their job. They're going to make mistakes, but let them do their job. And that is, I think, something that sometimes leaders of governments and state government, city government forget that, that's what Mitch did so effectively. He brought in really bright and talented people to his administration. Mayor Ballard did the same thing. You look around the city today, it's a who's who. The Sports Corp and the Chamber and yourself and lots of others, right, are all doing great things. It's because he found highly talented people to bring to his administration and then let them do their job. So I would say, I enjoyed very much the opportunity to work with the mayor and the whole team. At that time, Chris Cotterill and Michael Huber and yourself and lots of others on the team to do what was right for the city, which was transferring the water and wastewater to citizens, to take it out of the political realm and put it in a trust for the public trust that is a rare thing and a positive thing for ratepayers. He's a kind of, as you know, he's a what you see is what you get guy, and we needed, and I think at that time, a nuts and bolts mayor, and that's what he was. But he was more than that. He was a guy who knew leadership because he'd served in our nation's military, and he brought those military leadership skills to bear in a positive way. But that's the one trait that I'd say, he and Mitch are aligned.
Wouldn't you say, I always tell people, especially people who are about to meet Greg Ballard, like for the first time or don't know him that well, and I tell them all the same thing. Compliment Mayor Ballard's staff, and you're in like Flynn. Mm-hmm. He is so enormously proud of Ryan Vaughn running the Sports Corps, Michael Huber running the Great Indianapolis Chamber of Commerce, Greg Wilson, who heads the Indiana Civil Rights Commission. The list goes on and on. Jason Dudich, who was budget director under Governor Holcomb, David Reynolds.
Right.
We could do this all day.
Sure.
But another trait they shared, and I won't say that Mayor Ballard learned it from Mitch Daniels, but maybe he observed it while watching the Daniels administration. Greg Ballard was never afraid to roll the dice. Mm-hmm. That he knew for big changes called for bold decisions.
Absolutely.
And big decisions. And that to me is something they had in common. In fact, Greg Ballard, in one of his first meetings with Michael Huber, who was a top official in the administration, looked at Michael and said, "Find me my toll road deal." Mm-hmm. And that became the utility transaction.
He did it. Yeah, he found it. Yeah, I agree with you, Robert. He was willing to take a risk, and he's also willing to have a vision. He had a vision of where he wanted the city to go. And internet, you mentioned Governor Holcomb. I thought you were going to say traveling around the world, not only around the 92 counties of the state, but Eric has been around the world. And Mayor Ballard really started. Mitch had already obviously restarted that engine for our state, but Mayor Ballard took it and ran with it as well, where he was traveling, and great things came out of that. But he had an international vision for our city, and I think our city desperately needed, and still today we need to figure out what our next big thing is going to be. But he was pretty focused on a vision of us being a globally connected, city, and everything from cricket. You'll remember cricket fields to reaching out, which ended up being a huge win more recently. The emphasis to India's trips to India, and now we've got a 2,000, 3,000 person campus being built on the old airport site. And without Mayor Ballard reaching out, that doesn't happen.
It's been my contention that the most underrated aspect of Mayor Ballard's very successful 8 years as mayor was all the travel he did while he was an officer in the Marine Corps. Mm-hmm. I don't know that anyone has traveled as much throughout the world as Greg Ballard did as a private citizen. I know Lugar was in the military, in the Navy as well.
Right. But
Greg Ballard saw all these things in cities like Strasbourg and Paris and London and Berlin and other places and said, we can, and after he became mayor, he said, we can have this.
Right.
We can have better connectivity.
Absolutely.
And as someone who has traveled around the world, Nate, mm-hmm. what do you see in other cities that makes you say, this can come to Indianapolis or this can come to Indiana? What really impresses you?
Well, gosh, I think Indianapolis has become that city in many ways, but there's more to work on. But, Indianapolis has grown dramatically since I went to law school in the early and mid-'90s. It's a different place, and people come and they're absolutely blown away with what Indianapolis has to offer. So I think we've made a lot of inroads, for one. It's hard for me to answer that question because all cities are so different. You go to Nashville and it's a music scene. You go to Austin, it's all sorts of things. It's gaming and make Texas Austin weird, and they've done that pretty effectively. So I kind of reference, what's Indiana's next generation going to look like? What's the next generation Indy? What's 3.0 if you want to call it that? And I think there are a lot of great ideas that people are working on, and we're working on transportation initiatives and others. But transportation is one, right? There's a lot of people working on that piece. But you go to similar sized cities around the country, and Denver and others, and some will debate how effective the rail line transportation has been. And they have in Denver from the airport to the city a easy commute rail line, and I wonder sometimes if we shouldn't be pushing on that harder rather than the bus line and the different things we're doing there. But I think we're doing okay. But I don't have all the answers of what's going to really move us to the next level.
We've talked about some politics and elected officials. Nate Feltman ever thought about running for office?
I thought about it long ago, and that thought just kind of went away to some degree because. I've got a lot of friends, a lot of really good friends who have run, have served, and who are serving now. And I see what it does to their family and what kind of commitment it takes. and I feel like I can be pretty effective and enjoy I've got a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old, and I like to coach and spend time with them, and so I haven't ever seriously considered it since I've had kids, to be honest. But I know we need people who are willing, and I try to support those that I believe can do an effective job.
Do your kids have a choice in their university?
That's a good question. They do, actually, probably more than I did. I had a choice, but I was brainwashed early. So
you can picture your kids.
My kids are already saying IU. They're going to go to IU, but when they get a little older, maybe they'll consider some other options. Actually, I'm one of the few Hoosiers who can say, I think Purdue is an amazing place, and I've got a lot of friends who went to Purdue. Now, of course, I give them a hard time when we're playing them, and we have great battles when we're playing on the sports field, but Purdue is such an important institution to our state in so many ways, and to our country and world, obviously, with what they do and have done in engineering and beyond, in agriculture. But I'm a huge fan of Purdue, and have been for ever since I've been involved in economic development and seeing what they do to produce companies and patents and contribute to our state. I've been a big fan for a number of years.
Well, my son's about to make the trek up there, and he got admitted into the aviation school.
Awesome.
And is going to go up there, and I said, leave all your IU shirts at home, leave all your Notre Dame hats at home. I go, they won't get the joke.
Yeah.
Just don't take any chances. But he couldn't be more thrilled. And to anyone who thinks that leadership doesn't matter, in my view, it's the single most underrated part of any success is individual leadership. Man, woman, it doesn't matter. Mitch Daniels' tenure as president of Purdue can't probably be quantified as to what it has meant for that university.
I think that's right. He's changed the conversation around the country, too, and people have taken note. Of course, on the cost of college education and student loan situation, those are being debated on the national level in every way, and Mitch has addressed them and is addressing them in such significant ways and very entrepreneurial and business-like ways, and showing the way of what's possible, which, again, he's always focused on the art of the possible, and he's doing it. So, yeah, I agree with you.
Before we get to the 5 questions, I want to give you a chance to address a project of yours that is steeped in erudition and reading and wanting to learn more and share that learning and knowledge with others. Talk about the Liberty Fund.
Well, thanks. The Liberty Fund is a not as well-known institution as some in this state, but has an incredible impact around the world. So the Liberty Fund was founded in 1960, so it's been around a while. But we have a new headquarters just on 31 around the 116th Street exit near Delta Faucet there. And we do work around the world, and that work really is a unique thing. It's called Conversations, and we invite people to attend a conversation, and it's usually 15, 16 people with a discussion leader, and it's all around topics of liberty and individual liberty, individual responsibility, limited government. These are things that our founder, his name was Pierre Goodrich, believed were important. And we've been doing work since 1960, and our conference program has expanded around the world. So we do conferences all over the world, around 100 conferences a year. We publish books, usually out of circulation texts from Adam Smith to Hayek to others. And we have a digital presence. We have websites that one's called Law and Liberty, Econ Lib, Adam Smith, Online Library of Liberty. All these are resources that a lot of times people aren't aware of. They're right here in central Indiana. So it's for me, it's a labor of love, and it's to your earlier point, it's continuing education, my own education, which is what our founder wanted. And so it's a great opportunity to kind of scratch that political itch as well. I don't have to run for office. I can be engaged with engaging people around the world who are involved and engaged in freedom issues with institutions all over the world, and making a difference by having one conversation after another. And a lot of times those conversations lead to action, and action hopefully leads to positive results. Less socialism, more free enterprise. That's the hope.
And I would imagine your time overseas, especially in the old Soviet Union, just reinforced.
Absolutely. That's what's so wonderful, that my experiences and interests congealed with opportunities right here in Indiana, and that one I count as a real blessing, because I'm able, like I said, to travel the world, to meet people who are doing phenomenal things, learn from them, and hopefully bring some of those things back to Indiana.
We've reached the 5 questions portion of the Leaders and Legends podcast. No one has failed this quiz yet,
okay,
Nate, so
I hopefully won't be the first.
It was funny because in the podcast with Governor Daniels, we had so much to talk about. Quite frankly, we didn't even get to his time as governor. So I was going to skip the 5 questions. And he chuckled. He goes, "No, I'm ready." He goes, "No, I've prepared for these." So he got them in advance as a courtesy. And
that was
most
nice
folks
of you.
don't. Well, it seemed appropriate. So are you ready?
Ready.
First question. What was your first job?
First job would have been delivering newspapers in Mishawaka, Indiana. I was a newspaper boy.
That it's interesting because it's almost an antediluvian enterprise. So many people have said that was their first job.
Is that right?
Oh, it's got to be probably, if not half, a quarter of the people I've asked.
It's a great first job. It's a huge responsibility. You get those papers early in the morning.
And you're about our 30th podcast, roughly.
Yeah.
And so many of my friends growing up had that as their job, and it just doesn't exist.
It was a great first job. I had a lot of different jobs growing up, but that was the first one.
Question number 2. What was your first concert?
First concert, you'll like this one. The Beach Boys. The Beach Boys at Notre Dame. Remember, I grew up in South Bend, and had to be late 80s.
Was Stamos there with them?
Probably. And it looked definitely the 80s, but it was the Beach Boys at Notre Dame, the ACC it's called, and I think that song,
Kokomo?
Way Down in Kokomo, was their hit at the time. So I think that was my first. I've been to some lot better concerts, but that was a big hit at the time. Yeah.
Now, about when you were at the Soviet Union is when they started allowing Western artists to come over.
Right.
Famously, Billy Joel went over there. The Scorpions. Did you see anybody over there?
So that's funny you asked that. It would have been, I think it was, I'm trying to remember whether it was 90 or 94. I saw the Rolling Stones in the Olympics that the United States boycotted, and I think that would have been 84. They built a stadium, and it was Olympic Stadium in St. Petersburg. I saw the Rolling Stones. It was pretty awesome. So that was either I'm thinking it's 94 when I saw them. Yeah.
Number 3, if you could recommend one book to someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Gosh, that's tough because at Liberty Fund, we read a lot of books. So one that I've read more recently, but I can't say I've read all of it, but I'm trying to learn to read it better, is Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments. It goes by TMS for short. And that one has a lot of things about humanity. So Wealth of Nations was about economics. Theory of Moral Sentiments is about human beings. And I recently listened to a talk. This is a great recommendation. I don't know if it's great, but listeners can decide whether it's a great recommendation. Russ Roberts gives a weekly podcast at a Liberty Fund website called EconLib. It's the website, econlib.org, I believe. And Russ Roberts has written a book recently. I'm not going to remember the name of it, but it's about Adam Smith and how his theory of moral sentiments and how it applies to today, everyday living. And it talks about, being a good person, being loved or being lovely, and a lot of interesting things that you can get out of reading Adam Smith, the Theory of Moral Sentiments. So that's one that I'm still learning. I'm still a student. I need to read all of it, but it's sometimes slow slogging through.
It can be.
Yeah,
those older.
Right. Exactly
right. Question number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there as it happens, which event would you choose?
So many good ones. I think I'd go back to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. I got to go to Independence Hall a few years ago. Actually, I got to go when IU was in the, Sweet 16, or I think it was, I can't remember who they were playing, but it was 5 or 6 years ago, and they played in Philadelphia. So I went to that game, and went to Independence Hall, and it was really cool. And I just imagining what it would have been like to be there. And I visited Ben Franklin's grave, just meeting guys like that and being there. Gosh, this is when being decided what kind of country are we going to have, what kind of republic are we going to have, what the three equal branches of government are being decided. So that would have been my choice.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone in the world living today, 2 hours, talk about anything, whom would you choose?
Can I have two people, or just I have to limit it to one? I'm going to go with, I already mentioned one that you questioned me about, Mikhail Gorbachev. That'd be probably number one. A close second would be George Lucas, the founder of Star Wars. I'm a huge Star Wars fan, and getting a chance just to talk to him about his imagination on mythology, and I like to read about mythology and what he created with Star Wars. I think is pretty amazing, and it's obviously talk about popular culture. We talked about the evil empire. You said Star Wars SDI earlier. I mean, it all kind of puts all my interests together. So maybe I get the three of us together for a great conversation.
We can allow that at Leaders and Legends.
Okay,
just invite us.
All right.
We'd love to have
I try to pull
Gorbachev and Lucas on the podcast for sure.
I'm going to try to pull that together.
I remember showing my son Star Wars for the first time. He was probably 5 or 6. And I said, because we were trapped in the world of Dragon Tales and Caillou and all that abomination. And I just said, Andrew, I want you to watch this movie. It changed the world of entertainment.
Absolutely.
There was nothing like it before, and there's really kind of been nothing like it since.
Right.
And like all good young people, he got completely and totally hooked.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nate, so much for your time. You have done so many things. You have contributed so much to the success, not only of our city, but our state. You have done terrific work for charities. You have always been extremely kind to me. I can't thank you enough for your friendship and for appearing on Leaders and Legends. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Robert. It's been a lot of fun. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.